And so I just wanted to share a tiny bit. I'm writing, I think I told you, I'm writing this book. I'm having so much fun with this. This is an easy book to write. It's called Okay, I'm Mindful. Now what? Exploring the wonders of the mind. And it's a critique of mindfulness, a healthy critique, just in terms of the limitations of mindfulness. Mindfulness is unbelievably important, and the mindfulness revolution is a really cool deal. But eventually, it can top out or bottom out, because mindfulness in and of itself won't lead to enlightenment, even though some people say that. It's not really true. It basically, on one level, and it's not so easy to define, it's one of the things that's been really interesting for me is talking to all these scholars, translators from all over the world about what exactly is this thing called mindfulness. It's unbelievable how many definitions are out there. So the first thing I do is try to zip that definition down and then show that mindfulness is, on one level, it's just a pacifier. A really sophisticated, beautiful, elegant pacifier. But pacification alone doesn't liberate. Insight liberates. So the Buddha didn't invent it. The Buddha invented vipassana. He invented insight. And so what I do is I do a gentle critique of the kind of limitations of the mindfulness thing. And then, okay, now what? Well, then there's all these other practices. And I'm having a really fun time riffing on all those. And so just this morning, I started writing about the kind of that last third of this. This is going to be a really short book, famous last words. My aspiration was to keep it under 90 pages. I'm already at 90 pages. I just started writing this thing 3 weeks ago. It's like, oh man. So anyway, so just this morning, I started writing about the nocturnal practices. And so I spent the morning writing about liminal dreaming, diving back into that world. And this is Jennifer Dumpere's term, her neologism. That's her word for what was called previously hypnagogic, hypnopompic, pre and post dream states. And I interviewed Jennifer, by the way, in nightclub well over a year ago. Cool gal. Quite a nice little book called Liminal Dreaming, something like exploring the edges of consciousness. But it's really pretty interesting stuff, because liminal dreaming is a way to explore. Liminal means threshold. And in Buddhist language, this would be bardo dreaming. It's that dream awake state when you're just falling into sleep. You're not awake, you're not asleep, you're not here, you're not there. That's a bardo. And so it's a really interesting state to explore. And one of the reasons that is very interesting is it kind of points to the importance and the notion of liminality altogether. That we have these kind of reified tendencies to think of things just so solidly, so articulately, so black and white, yes, no, on, off, dead, alive. This kind of binary way, dualistic way of relating to everything. And liminal dreaming is really cool because it's just, pardon the play on words a little bit, but it's not just black and white. It's like 50 Shades of Gray, right? Remember that? It was a really bad movie. I couldn't even get through it. Yeah, 50 Shades of Gray, like all the nuances of the mind. And one of the things that I was discovering when I was doing just a little bit of re-researching on this was how the notion of liminality altogether is actually really helpful. That working with liminal dreaming as a preparatory practice to lucid dreaming, and that's the way I contextualize it in the book. It's also a way to work with liminal spaces and liminal states altogether that can kind of expand our usual reifying ways. And we see this now, once you start to open your eyes to it, this notion of liminality is ubiquitous. Like transgender, bisexual people, they're liminal beings. Liminal spaces would include things like transit lounges, airports, bus stations, hallways, funeral homes, elevators, any kind of space where you're not here, you're not there. Another liminal type of experience would be coming back from a really long trip. And, you arrive home, but you're not really home, right? You're home, but your mind is still back in whatever, Cabo. And so once you sensitize yourself to this notion of liminality, you see how it ties in really beautifully to the whole Bardo principle, that liminal states are absolutely everywhere. Bardo states are absolutely everywhere. And so by working with liminal states of consciousness, this kind of dimmer model, I think it's really important to transition from this kind of clumsy, outdated Western light switch model of mind, on, off, yes, no, black, white, dead, alive. I mean, even scientists now, it's really interesting. I had a conversation with some scientists a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about how with refined measurements, even in the neurosciences, they're actually now finding that parts of your brain can be awake and asleep. It's not like the whole thing is synchronous. You can have different aspects of your brain that are, fully online or not online or partially online. And so this is also, by the way, echoed in the great wisdom traditions where, I came across a really interesting text from the non-dual Shaiva Tantra tradition where they talk about 9 different states of lucidity, 9 different states where you take waking, dreaming, and sleeping, and then you have, here, I'll just do the first 3 and then you'll see how it works. You have waking within waking, waking within dreaming, waking within sleeping, and then you go to dreaming, dreaming within dreaming, dreaming within. And so you actually have this really interesting kind of granularity, gradations of consciousness, which replaces this Western light switch model with a dimmer. It's not on, off, dead, alive. It's gross to subtle to really subtle. And that's a great contribution of the meditative traditions and things like liminal dreaming. It installs this dimmer. And I throw this into the mix because a lot of people really struggle with lucid dreaming. It's just not easy. But everybody can practice liminal dreaming. Everybody. You're just more aware of your mind as there's this kind of decrescendo, diminuendo from gross to subtle to very subtle. And you can watch your mind popping in and out of consciousness. There's actually a classic set of stages. This is articulated by Andreas Mavromatis, this massive book on hypnagogia he wrote years ago, where he talks in his cartography, these kind of classic stages of hypnagogia, which I think is a little bit dated. I don't agree with everything he says. But one thing he does say that is really cool, one of the most interesting phases is this transition from thought to thought image to dream. And so if you really pay attention to your dream, and even installing this doctrine, this teaching can help you start to track this. When you first lie down, you're still thinking, you're still somewhat in contact with the world. But then things start to slow down. You enter the sensory deprivation chamber. The 5 consciousness dissolve pretty much into the body, right? And eventually 6 consciousness itself starts to dissolve. That's mind as we know it. And you start to see that when you're dipping in and out. And so it's super interesting to track this because thoughts start to transition into a phase called thought image amalgamation. And you'll notice this, your thinking decreases and your imaging increases. So thoughts are replaced by images. So you enter this really interesting hybridization of thought image amalgamation. There's still mental content, but it's not thought. Now it's images. Not quite a dream, so that's the Bardo part. And then eventually, if you track that thought image amalgamation will transition into these micro little dreamlets, these little hiccups of dreams where you can completely practice lucid dreaming. I mean, just because the thing is, the dream lasts 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds doesn't make it any less viable. I do this every single night. It's like watching bubbles come up, these little micro bubbles of dreams, they pop up and then another one comes up and it pops up. And, Tartan Tulku actually, Rinpoche, talks about how you can kind of hold the hand of a thought. I love this image. And like holding the hand of a child, you can lead consciousness, you can lead that thought into this space. and watch, this is my terminology, watch the winds inflate that thought into an image, into a dream. And it's a form of wake initiated lucid dreaming, where you can watch how thought becomes reality at the level of the dream. So it's really interesting, and it expands not just the way we dream and fall into sleep and dream, but also expands our notion of liminality into the waking state. That things are not as articulate and reified and crisp as we think. There are these, kind of 500 shades of gray. So that's my sermon for today.